to introduce my co-facilitator, Joniesha, affectionately known as JoJo Hickson. She is a second-year clinical PsyD student at the Chicago School. She is passionate about social justice advocacy and steadfast in her pursuit for Black liberation. Joniesha started a nonprofit organization called Dear Black Prophets Co., which seeks to empower, educate, and unite the Black community and our allies. Please welcome my co-facilitator, JoJo.
Thank you so much, Aneesha. I love you. Now I'm actually going to introduce my sister in arms, Aneesha Perkins, who obtained her Master's of Arts degree in Counseling Psychology from Trinity Christian College and graduated from Hampton University with a Bachelor of Arts degree in Journalism. She is a rising third-year clinical PsyD student at the Chicago School, my classmate, and she is also passionate about women's matters and the transition of intergenerational trauma. So we're so glad to have you, Aneesha, and I'm excited to get this event going with you.
Me too. Thanks, sis. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's introduce our panelists, JoJo. First up, I am honored and privileged to introduce Dr. Jessica Smedley, who is a licensed clinical psychologist practicing in the Washington, D.C. metro area and co-chair of the DCPA COVID-19 Task Force. She has extensive training and experience providing treatment for members of underserved, underrepresented communities. Dr. Smedley also has unique experiences in local and legislative advocacy, where she has talked with leaders about the needs of both psychologists and members of the community as it relates to social justice issues. Further, Dr. Smedley has a unique background that integrates issues of trauma and spirituality, particularly as they relate to urban communities of color. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Smedley. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for that amazing welcome. Thank you.
So now I am privileged and honored as well to introduce Dr. Candice Hargens, who is actually an award-winning assistant professor of counseling psychology at the University of Kentucky, where she studies sex, social justice, and leadership, all with the love ethic. So she's spicy and she's well-esteemed. She is a licensed psychologist providing individual and couple sex therapy, and she is also the founding director of the Center for Healing Racial Trauma. So I'm definitely gonna need her contact after the event, and I'm gonna be all in her email.
You already have it.
I know, I just saw that.
Thank you.
And last but definitely not least, it is my honor and privilege also to introduce Dr. Delecia Pittman. She is an associate professor of counseling in the Graduate School of Education and Human Development at the George Washington University. She also directs the clinical mental health counseling program, where she oversees the training of nearly 100 graduate counselor trainees a year. She is the first African-American board-certified counseling psychologist in the District of Columbia, as well as a licensed professional counselor. Her work examines Black communities and contexts, exploring the contributions of race, culture, environment, and diverse lived experiences on health behavior and health outcomes in Black emerging adults. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Pittman. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to get started. Thank you, ladies, for having us, for hosting us, for holding this space for us. A lot of us do have the honor and privilege of knowing exactly what Juneteenth is and what it means to us, but some people have just started to learn about the holiday and what it means. So I'm gonna ask Dr. Smedley to please set the stage for us and give us a little bit of information about what Juneteenth is and why we intentionally decided to have this event on today.
Absolutely. And if we can move to our first slide in this, I have a visual that kind of goes along with what I'll say. So Juneteenth is a holiday that has been long observed within the African American community. It is a celebration of the emancipation of Black bodies from the horrific tragedy and sin of slavery. Juneteenth is an opportunity to pause, reflect, and honor the painful yet beautifully resilient journey of the African American experience in the United States. So this image was intentionally created to set the framework of this conversation. Many people try to identify landmarks of time, such as on Juneteenth, such as the end of segregation, the end of slavery, the end of Jim Crow laws, or even the election of Barack Obama, as to why Black people should finally be okay. This image on the slide is an intentional reminder as to why we are in fact not okay. We have experienced some significant milestones that represent the very gradual humanization and freedom of Black bodies, yet we know far too well that the deadly spirits of Willie Lynch and Jim Crow remain in 2020. This reality for Black people in the United States creates a constant daily presence of an emotional duality. We have joy, but are fatigued from controlling our fear. We love, but we are weary from persistent rage. We laugh, but maintain a readily available lament. That is why Black mental health is imperative and why it deserves to be honored on this day that we know as Juneteenth.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Jess.
Absolutely.
Now, let's take a moment of silence, a moment to remember the meaning of today, a moment to celebrate freedom, a moment to honor the tears, pain, and resiliency of our ancestors, a moment to remember their plight, a moment to acknowledge our Black pain that runs generations deep. Let's take a moment for the losses of our beautiful brothers and sisters we lost to COVID-19. A moment for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin, and the countless others we lost unjustly who belong to our community. They are not forgotten, nor will they ever be. Can't you see them? Can't you see us? We are not invisible. So right now, let's take a moment of silence. Thank you. So let's go ahead and get this conversation started. I want to read a really interesting statistic that I found. It says, regarding COVID-19 and the Black community, Black Americans represent 13.4% of the US population. According to the US Census Bureau, but counties with higher Black populations account for more than half of all COVID-19 cases and almost 60% of deaths, according to CNN. So my question to my panel, the Black community has been impacted disproportionately by COVID-19. What are some of the reasons?
I'm happy to jump in first. I'd say that the way we've been organizing our neighborhoods for generations is probably the first feature of it. So who has immediate access to healthcare is organized by neighborhood, who is living with whom and how many people are living together is organized by neighborhood. So at a structural community organization level created by redlining, I'd say that that's one instance of why this would be overrepresented among Black people. I'd say that secondly, and this experience was one that was reported in the news here in Lexington, Kentucky, there's a Black woman who experienced symptoms of COVID-19. I think it was early March, and she went to the hospital and they turned her away. And she felt like her symptoms were not subsiding, so she went to the hospital again. And they told her that she just needed to self-quarantine, but that they couldn't do anything to treat her. By the third time she went, she had to be placed on a ventilator. And so the extent to which she had to advocate for herself to be treated, and she was diagnosed with COVID-19, to me suggests that there's some inequity in how healthcare professionals, whether they're nurses or physicians or whoever else would have been a part of that staff treating her represents and understands and believes Black people, and then finds Black people worthy of the limited resources that were available to treat COVID. So I think the inequities in who's perceived as valuable, worthy, and human then dictate who gets treatment when, if at all.
I think those are important structural barriers to understand that exacerbate risk of infection and certainly increased risk for death among African Americans who contract COVID. I think adding to that, I think we really have to look at educational inequities and the ways in which that confers access to certain kinds of jobs. Black communities are much more likely to be employed in jobs that are now deemed frontline, and essential. So you're going to see higher proportions of African Americans in warehouse workers, grocery store employees, hospital janitorial staff, and janitorial staff of other offices that are essential during this time. And so their risk of exposure by virtue of where they work is increased, and then is compounded by some of the factors that Dr. Hargons mentioned. African Americans are also much more likely to live in intergenerational households. And so when you live in intergenerational households, you may have individuals in that household who are vulnerable. They're older, and by virtue of being older, are part of that population that is more vulnerable. The space that they share is typically smaller. So even within those spaces, you don't have, a lot of room. Even in DC, where 48% of the population is Black, DC real estate by and large is quite small. Sort of the footprint is small. So you really don't have a lot of space even to self-quarantine should you be exposed without putting the other people that you live with at risk. So I think, certainly, people want to point to protests and social gatherings and those kinds of things. But those really aren't the big drivers of infection in our community, and certainly physician bias and deciding who is worthy of those very limited resources once they are admitted to the hospitals are significant drivers of the high rates of infection and death that we're seeing in our communities.
I think I would also add to that a lot of people are attributing it to, Black people have higher rates of hypertension. Black people have higher rates of diabetes and pre-existing conditions. And while those are all valid, I know we'll get to this later in the conversation, we have to think about why those pre-existing conditions are higher in our communities as well too. So higher rates of stress, not always having access to healthcare, or in the event of an emergency, not always being taken seriously, as you've said, or having access to get care, or response teams getting to certain areas in an adequate amount of time to be able to treat the issues and symptoms that are being experienced as well.
I wanted to just jump in to build on Dr. Pittman's point, because as you were naming these essential work, I'm thinking about each member of my family who's currently in one of those positions. So I have a brother who's working in a grocery store warehouse, a sister who's working at Walmart, a mother-in-law who's working in janitorial staff, and thinking about that they never stopped working. In fact, they were asked to work more, 16 hours some days, and paid, of course, a little bit extra, but is the pay worth it when the consequence could be exposure to a highly contagious and then sometimes deadly disease? But the companies that were suggesting they work more and really highlighting, oh, we have heroes here and we're so excited, haven't increased their healthcare packages. They haven't done anything to mitigate that exposure.
These are really great points.
Do you have any comments? I was interested in your opinion as well.
For me, I'm just taking it in. As they were talking about that, I did also find this statistic that said approximately 30% of African American adults with mental illness receive treatment each year, compared to the US average of 43%. So that kind of goes along with what Dr. Smedley was saying. So I think these are really great points.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I think that the graphic that we chose for this particular point in the presentation or webinar really implores the audience to dig deeper and to look past what you've been taught and to look past your own biases. So I think that our panelists really wrapped it up really well. So the next question I want to pose to the panelists and also my co-facilitator: why are people considering this a double pandemic? Like, we see the APA released a statement that specifically called the oppression against Black people a racism pandemic. So why?
Well, I know that when we first talked about doing this event, and even prior to that, people were making comments about, racism, and we're in this pandemic. And I thought, well, Black people have been in a pandemic for our entire existence in this country. And so while we're not minimizing racism to a virus or to an illness, we're saying that it's just as deadly. The impact has been deadly for its existence. And so I think it's important to recognize the emotional toll, strain, and stress that has always been in our DNA, and to reiterate the impact that it's had, in addition to experiencing a viral pandemic at the same time.
Yeah, to add to that, I'd say that we saw a lull, I'd say, in the highly publicized brutality and racial and racist violence against Black people in the media. And then this year in particular, the media started picking those stories up again. And so it wasn't that they didn't exist. In fact, some people would argue that in this current presidential administration, there might have been more, but some media decided that they would draw attention away from that to other things. And now, at a time where people were sitting home and more readily available to watch this, I think we saw the stories get additional press, and that press led to social media sharing and viral depictions and representation of Black people being murdered and brutalized. And so the actual events have not changed, but the media depiction of them has re-upped again. I think it was going on when I was in my doctoral training in 2013, 14, 15. I saw quite a bit of it. And then in the first 5 years of me being a professor, I didn't see it as much. I saw it start to dwindle down, just how much was talked about, how much was exposed. And I think we're seeing it again. But I think the beauty of it is that the work that we're seeing now, the protests that we're seeing now, the advocacy we're seeing now builds on the legacy of the movement for Black lives that started in 2013. And so it's not that people are newly initiated, it's that they had that time to structure, to get organized, to continue the work when it wasn't being publicized, so that now the effects of it are taking place. You're seeing companies, and you're seeing policy, and you're seeing changes, and you're seeing more people involved, and you're seeing organized efforts that are really a function of the beautiful work that has been done behind the scenes when the media wasn't there to showcase it.
I think those are both really great points. I think, to Dr. Hargon's point, when I was in my doctoral program, the last year of my doctoral program, Trayvon Martin was murdered. And so I think there are these waves of outrage and uprisings that coincide with these murders that are happening, that are being caught on tape, and the ways in which the media pick them up and share them with the community. I think it certainly has an impact on how not only, others, non-Black people of color and white folks experience racism and engage with it. Currently, I'd say probably the last month and a half, really, events of the last month and a half have really sort of put it on the radar of white folks in a way that's really sort of pushing white outrage. And it's a conversation that I'm constantly having with my white colleagues and my white friends around, like, what about this is different? This is not new in our community. George Floyd is not the first Black man to be choked to death on film. And so what is it about now that makes this urgent for you in a way that the Black men and women who have died before him have not sort of given rise to that? And I think it really is that COVID is hitting them, right? They're at home and they can't ignore it. They can't sort of distract themselves from it in a way that they've been, that their privilege has allowed them to in the past. In 2016, Dr. Kamara Jones was then the president of the APHA, which is the public health organization, the American Public Health Association, asserted that racism is a public health issue, right? That racism is killing Black and brown people in this country. And I think there was a real shift in understanding and needing to really understand the impact that structural racism has, not only on life expectancy, but also health outcomes. Many of the things that we attribute to individual behavior are actually born of structural inequity that is then rooted in racism. And I think that's really important to understand. One of the things that I tell my students is that, in this country, racism is the thread that stitches the stripes of our flag together. It is intricately woven into everything that this country is founded on. And if you are born in this country and socialized in this country, you are fish and it is water. You don't even know you're wet. And so, the only way to sort of move beyond that is to be intentionally anti-racist, right? That you have to sort of recognize the ways in which structural inequities sort of marginalize and disenfranchise communities, the ways in which we perpetuate that, even when there are laws in place to protect folks from that. So, this idea of it being sort of a double pandemic and a racism pandemic, as Dr. Hargons said, is not new to us, it is new to others. And so I think is what's really salient about this moment, is that we have the attention of others, and they are responsible for dismantling anti-Black racism in this country and white supremacy and whiteness, and really sort of addressing those in ways that can stop jeopardizing the health of Black and brown communities.
I don't know if you all saw the talk the other day that the Institute for the Study and Promotion of Race did with Dr. Carlton Green and Dr. Janet Helms was on. There was a moment when Dr. Janet Helms said, we were talking about crisis. They were talking about crisis and feeling that we're in this state of crisis, this racism, it's so all of a sudden in our faces. And she so eloquently said, we have to remember whose crisis this is. This is not our crisis. We have been in this reality forever. This is their crisis. And that felt like such a weight lifted off, even just me in that moment and thinking about it that way. And to remember to set boundaries as needed and to not feel like you have to always have these conversations. But to bring it back to this point, I think that this visual is so powerful because that bottom half or bottom 80% of this pyramid is exactly a racism pandemic. That's exactly what it is. So if you look at all of those things that are listed there, those are all of the things that attribute to the emotional weight and toll that Black lives experience on a day-to-day, from generation to generation. So I think that, going back to your original question, this visual, sums up everything we've stated.
Dr. I just want to say something as far as something that you said. is that I think it's really interesting because when you really look at this, the trauma that the Black community has experienced is intergenerational.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's when I meant it when I said in a moment of silence, it runs deep, generation from generation to generation. So I think you made a really good point, and I think we have to look at it as something that is not just impacting us here today and now, but this started even, I believe way back in slavery. So.
Absolutely.
Can I say something? This is Anna. I don't know why you can't see me, but it said, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I did press share screen, but it says I'm not able to. Anyway, it's disabled, host disabled, participant screen. Okay.
So
I think that's because you're not a panelist.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we will hold a question and answer time at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to actually make a comment regarding you brilliant, beautiful Black women and all the things that you said. I think that it's really important that we're going to have this conversation about how this double pandemic is impacting our mental health, because if you think about it, we were already constantly being assaulted, constantly seeing Black people dying on the media like it was normal. And so when one of you said, you're asking your colleagues, why now? Why is this different? It kind of talks about our already inherent defense mechanisms when people, it's like performative activism. A lot of people are throwing that around. So it's kind of like, I think it's important for us to talk about the implications of that skepticism and like why we're doubting people when they're now saying Black Lives Matter, when this has been going on before, George Floyd.
I think skepticism is a healthy, normal thing to have. So I think we should hold on to that and be critical of people who are new to the movement, not critical in critiquing them, but critical in deciding whether or not the intention is true and long-standing and as long-suffering as it will need to be to dismantle systems of racial oppression. So I think the people who are saying that now have to have some grit around whether or not they can tolerate critique, whether they can tolerate evaluation, whether they can tolerate scrutiny, because that is important so that we know we can rely on you. And if we can only rely on you to put a post up, that's not the level of strength and determination that is needed to really dismantle this. It's nice in showing, but nice doesn't dismantle racist systems.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Let's keep this conversation going and let's go into the next question. So as we are thinking about racism, we know that it can result in symptoms of stress and trauma. Why is it important to acknowledge that trauma can be an implication of experiencing racism?
So I would like to first introduce this slide. I first saw this slide that was created by our colleague, Dr. Maisa Akbar in Connecticut. She recently did a presentation for the New York Psychological Association. And when I saw this slide, it just hit me. I said, this is exactly it. There doesn't need to be an explanation from my perspective. So when you specifically put this Black trauma in the context of our history, it's as clear as day. I mean, I really want to encourage people just to take literally 5 or 10 seconds just to look at this and take it in and really absorb how you even feel reading it, how you think people have been able to survive each and every aspect of the traumas listed on this screen.
Yeah, I think these kinds of timelines are really powerful reminders of just how little time has passed. And one of the things that is always a constant reminder for me, my grandmother was born in 1935 and grew up in a very segregated Texas And all of her K-12 education was in segregated schools. She was almost 30 before the Civil Rights Act was passed. So, I think if you're in, this webinar and you've had sentiments of that was so long ago, I have living relatives who very much remember it. My grandmother does not talk about her childhood. There are many parts of her childhood that she won't discuss. And I think that is rooted in the trauma of growing up in the Jim Crow South and having parents who were sharecroppers and having grandparents who were slaves, right? And so, I think that lineage is traceable, and we know the impacts, we feel the impacts, in the stories that she does tell, the pain is still palpable. And so, I think it's important to recognize that if it is not part of your ancestry, that there are those of us who still walk this earth and it's still very much alive and well in our families intergenerationally.
I think to speak to that, actually, Dr. Pittman, I think it's a good point and necessary point for us to discuss how Black people are responding to their trauma and how ill-informed it is for people to try to police the way that we are responding to our trauma. So when you see people saying, why are they rioting? Why won't they peacefully protest? Again, I encourage the audience to take a look at this timeline and ask yourself, again, how would you be able to survive this? How would you feel if you were peacefully protesting for years and people were still killing you, lynching you, abusing you? So.
I think you don't get to wound someone and then dictate how they heal or the time frame in which they heal. And so, if you are white identified in this country, you are connected to an oppressive history, past and present. And so you don't get to dictate, you don't have to like it, but you certainly don't get to dictate how people express their rage and their pain. And it's probably going to make you uncomfortable. And it should make you uncomfortable. Black and brown people are socialized to make white people feel comfortable all the time. And I think that's sort of the underbelly of the criticism around these uprisings. Protests are inherently non-peaceful, right? By definition, they disrupt the status quo. And so, the idea that, this idea of having a peaceful protest, again, is tone policing how people express their discontent with their collective treatment. And so, quite frank, personally, I don't have a problem with targets being burned to the ground. Like, I have no investment in those targets. Those targets are in our communities. They are not of our communities typically, right? So when you look at, the businesses that are, that are being destroyed in cities where there are uprisings that become violent, very few of them are businesses that belong to members of our communities, right? They're typically large commercial corporate banks. And that's not to say that the small businesses that have been in communities for decades aren't being harmed as well. But that is the cost of uprising. That is the cost of injustice. And until those things start to happen, people tend to not listen. And that's not to say that I'm endorsing that, but that is not the place that I focus my energies on, right? So it's like, what are people trying to tell you and why? But I think you also have to be mindful that people are infiltrating what are otherwise nonviolent protests and disrupting those narratives to draw attention from the issue, because the media likes to go there. It's consistent with the narrative of Black violence that the media plays into all too often.
I just want to touch and agree with all those points. just co-sign and retweet everything you just said.
I agree. And I think that we also have to think about um, the neurobiology of trauma, right? So, what must that look like for Black people to live in a constant state of distress or some level of fear? What must the tension in our bodies be that we hold to make white people comfortable, right? In work settings, in education settings, in public. Um, so I think it's important that we also think about our actual physical, cognitive, mental well being when we think about trauma too,
Yeah.
because it takes a toll.
I'm thinking about spikes in cortisol level. I'm thinking about decreases in heart rate variability, spikes in heart rate, talking about your neurotransmitter chemistry changing. I'm talking about people who hold their breath when they're distressed and not
Yeah.
being oxygenated enough to concentrate, having a difficult time focusing, having a difficult time being less vigilant or reducing hypervigilance, always feeling on guard, muscle tension, headaches when you walk into a room that's predominantly white habitus, like all these somatic and psychophysiological symptoms of race-based stress and in a chronic way, racial trauma, that they happen for many of us. And it's something you can't get away from, like typical PTSD symptoms where this was a one-time thing and now you struggle with avoiding or working through or having nightmares or hypervigilance around this one-time thing. It's like you never get away from it. And so you rarely get away from it. And so when you create those pockets where you do, that's nice. But for the most part, most of us work in settings where we are not in the majority. And I think that takes its toll, even if people are polite. And so I just want to name that your politeness or your smiles, as opposed to like explicit or covert like aggression toward us, don't typically protect us from having to navigate white culture, which may or may not be the culture we grew up in. Some of us did grow up in predominantly white areas. And so we understood early on how to navigate those cultures, but the strategy that goes into navigating it, the intentionality, is a cognitive load that people who don't have to think about two cultures at the same time don't have to bear. And so my bandwidth is reduced some days because I'm thinking about impression management strategy and the research paper I want to write. And I think it's important to name the psychological processes, like you said, Dr. Smedley, because if we're talking to a primarily mental health audience, then you want to be able to have this language to use with your clients. You want to be well versed in the chemical aspects of it, the somatic, cognitive, emotional, affective, social, spiritual aspects of it, so that you're aware of how to talk about it and you can empathize with it.
Absolutely. And I also want to reiterate the importance of being able to become more aware and fluent of that so that we accurately diagnose. As providers, people of color, Black people, are often misdiagnosed at far higher rates than the average population. And so when you think about the symptoms that you just mentioned and how many Black kids are overdiagnosed with ADHD
Yes.
or bipolar, or adolescents who are overdiagnosed with even a personality disorder or a psychotic disorder,
Yes.
because we're not taking into account on the last slide that has been their history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it's really crucial as someone who specializes in diagnostics in Black and Brown communities. It's incredibly important not to pathologize sort of the somatic experiences that folks report. If you look at the literature, Black and Brown communities are much more likely to experience the symptoms of trauma somatically, and so in which we relate to our bodies and to one another is really important to understand and to understand in context and in a culturally responsive and culturally sensitive context. If you're not really clear about the contexts in which someone's living or someone has grown up, you might want to reserve judgment for diagnosis. And a diagnosis can be helpful in understanding sort of the appropriate treatment and intervention, but it's certainly not necessary. And I think the fear around being labeled or stigmatized is often a deterrent for most Black and brown folks, particularly Black, come to therapy. And I think that's real. It's very much rooted in a very healthy cultural mistrust of Western medicine. So I spend a lot of time educating my clients around sort of what they're experiencing, how I'm understanding what they're experiencing, whether they do or don't meet criteria for a mental illness, and what the value of that label might be to them, how it helps me understand and intervene in ways that can support their healing. But most practitioners, and I belong to a lot of Facebook groups of therapists, most of which are predominantly white, and the ways in which I have to go in on them about some of the things that fly out of their face, through their fingers, in those groups is really problematic and really detrimental to our communities. And so, it takes a great deal of trust and belief in a white therapist for me to refer a Black client to them. They have to have long demonstrated histories of doing the work, their internal work, for that to happen, but recognizing that there are not enough Black therapists for us to serve the entire Black community. So it is really incumbent on Black therapists, Black educators. Our kids spend a lot of time in classrooms with white educators who are perpetuating systemic racism in the ways in which they engage our kids. And so, and those kids grow up to be wounded adults. And that I think is really problematic as well.
One thing, as everyone is speaking, one thing that stands out to me is the thought of being hyper-vigilant, being mistrustful or being guarded. And earlier someone mentioned something about, police brutality, and it's like, listen to this. Blacks are 5 times more likely than whites to be unfairly stopped by the police because of their race or ethnicity, according to Pew Research Center. And so I even think about myself, I think about my friends in a sense of whenever you see the police, there's this automatic fear, this automatic fear of, I don't even want to get pulled over, and it's even at the point where it's like, okay, should I record before I get pulled over in case anything happens and I have some type of proof. And so as we talk about this, I just think about just the state of mind, we're always on. And so, I just think about that state of always being hyper-vigilant about things and mistrustful.
I think one question that I share with members of the audience who don't think through racial trauma often is to simply ask in your intake, how does racism, if at all, impact any of the things that you've described to me today? It's an open-ended question that allows a client, depending on their racial identity, to then describe for you how they draw the connections. Now, later on, depending on how thorough you are with your own identity as a racialized being, you might be able to further expand on that and build on that and think about the systemic pieces and the interpersonal pieces and all of that. But simply asking, how does racism, if at all, impact the way you're experiencing what you've described to me? The symptoms they've given you, the presenting concern they've given you, the life history and background they've given you, the educational experiences they've given you, the health behaviors they've shared with you. It could potentially impact all of those levels. So just adding that question to an intake, especially those of us who consistently do those initial consultations. So some of the training staff, informing your trainees that that's an important question to ask is the first step, I think, in opening the conversation.
I think that's a fantastic question to ask. I think beyond that, understanding that even if your client isn't able to articulate the ways that it's impacted, anything that they're sharing with you, to know that it does, right? That they exist in a system that is inherently racist, and they may not be able to connect the dots, as Dr. Hargons mentioned, based on their own racial identity. they may not be connecting those two things. And certainly, particularly if they are Black and or brown and are not racially ambiguous, you can likely assume, pretty accurately assume, that they're experiencing racism, and they may just not be connecting a narrative of internalizing that experience to racism, but it certainly does not preclude them to being vulnerable to it.
I think that it's important for us to, again, remember why we're here. We're here to honor our ancestors and to honor the pain that we have endured as a community. And just to go back to this graphic. So I want to pose a question to the panel of how can we cope? How can we cope with all of this reiterations of racism? It's like every single decade or every single century, it's always something. So what can you offer to the audience for people who are looking for ways to deal with this trauma and, you know, the heaviness of what's going on?
I have a 4-part way that I explain the different ways to cope with people. So I think we have numbing, we have self-care, we have collective care, and then we have soul care. And those 4 levels are all useful. I don't minimize the value of any, but you don't want to over rely on any one, and you want to have a repertoire of coping within each one that you can draw upon. If you over rely on any one type of coping within those categories, or any one type of coping in general, 1, you'll get bored with it. 2, it'll be less effective. And so you have to have a bunch of strategies, but numbing is anything binge watching, binge shopping, binge drinking, binge eating, binge all of it. Sometimes you need to feel numb. And that's why I don't minimize the fact that binging in some respects is necessary at specific points in time. But self-care are those individual things you do for yourself, like how you set your sleep routine, how you eat, exercising. So not the things that keep us numb, but the things that sustain us and help us to be well at the individual level. That's self-care. Collective care is what you do in community and solidarity. And so that might be cuddling, that might be being with loved ones, talking on Zoom in this era of social distancing with people you care about. It might be commiserating or strategizing with your colleagues, having a group of allies together, organizing. Even resistance work can be collective care, using music and healing modalities like that. All of those are under the umbrella of either self or collective care, depending on whether you're doing it individually or in community. And then soul care is depending on whether or not you align with religious or spiritual beliefs. It could be meditation, it could be prayer, it could be hiking and being at one with nature. It could be any of those things. And to draw it all together, for show therapy, because we need to unpack it, and you can't unpack it alone. You do need to do it with somebody that is competent in understanding how systemic white supremacy or white inferiority complexes inform your social emotional world.
And I would add to that, I think those are really fantastic. I'm gonna borrow that.
You can listen, collective care. Share.
One of the things that I think is really important to disentangle, both if you're a clinician or if you're trying to understand your own processes, is understanding the type of fatigue that you're experiencing. There's psychological fatigue, emotional fatigue, and physical fatigue. And a lot of us will describe just feeling tired, but we got enough sleep. And like, I slept 8, 9, 10 hours and I'm still tired. Sleep does nothing for psychological or emotional fatigue. And so I think the areas of coping that Dr. Hargons mentioned, you're really going to want to try to pair those coping strategies to the kind of fatigue that you're experiencing, right? Like if your body is physically tired, there are ways to take care and restore your physical space. If you're psychologically or emotionally fatigued, those are going to come from things that fill your cup. It's going to be those collective coping. It's going to be through therapy. It's going to be finding joy, choosing joy, inserting yourself in places with people who understand you, people who get it, and allowing them to pour into you. And that also requires that you recognize what you need. And so spend a little time being self-reflective, and sort of understanding where the dearth is, like where is the gap, and what's draining you. If it is, I for one don't love teletherapy. but that's where we are, and my clients show up and I show up for them, but it's exhausting, right? I'm incredibly introverted, and so it takes a lot out of me to do that. And so when I wrap up my therapy day, I have to take some time for me. And so recognizing, like, how do you restore and prepare, particularly if you have to give, if you have children, if you have a partner, if you are a caregiver, if you're an educator, how do you take the time to sort of pay attention to your psychological and emotional well-being is going to be crucial. If you need to disconnect, you know, it is easy to stay on social media and to get in keyboard wars, with folks trying to dismantle anti-Black racism in your friend groups. Excuse me. Okay. So really thinking about like, how do you, you know, how do you do that in a way that feels restorative, that helps you sort of pay attention and ask for help if that's what you need?
I think those are all amazing suggestions. And to add to that, I think it's important that we honor the parts of our culture that we numb to get through every day, to get through white spaces, to get through spaces that we have to turn down. So have that. When you, sorry, having some distraction here. When you have that time, when you have that downtime, especially in a collective space, you know, how helpful for all of us has it been to have DJ D Nice, you know, play music, and to have these versus battles that are highlighting Black music, Black gospel music. What are some things that are art or other ways of culture that you can honor to say, hey, we are powerful, we are empowered, we belong here, we continue to thrive in the midst of our pain. And so
I just want to thank you, Dr. Smedley, for organizing this, because in a lot of ways, this is soul care, this is collective care, depending on your experience of just being here and bearing witness to 5 beautiful Black women speaking thoughtfully and intentionally and carefully about mental health on Juneteenth. Like, that experience in and of itself is valuable, and you contributed to my care today. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that. I'm very humbled, but happy to do it. We have to do this. I grew up, you know, being taught we have to care for each other. We have to care for the community. You know, grew up celebrating and honoring Juneteenth since I was a small child. So how could I integrate all of my worlds today? And so I just thank you all for joining me here.
Well, that's awesome. I completely agree. I think that this requires all of us to work together as brothers and sisters, and just to come together, you know, to heal together and to work through it all together. So I love that. My question is, it seems like as a community, we have some fears and concerns about mental health services, specifically going to therapy and confiding in someone else. Can you ladies speak more on this?
Yeah, I think, you know, early on,
Get
pretty, can you all hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. We get socialized pretty early on to sort of keep things within the family. And so, you know, I think also rooted in a very healthy cultural mistrust of Western medicine. And there are lots of books and stories and, you know, resources out there if you really want to understand the abuses on Black bodies by medicine, everything from, you know, testing, birth control, and sterilization of Black women. And, you know, Tuskegee and vaccine testing, you know, that I think that extends to mental health, certainly. I think even the ways in which we talk about mental health in some of our communities, you know, the crazy aunt or uncle that we have, you know, there can be, even within our communities and the ways we talk about mental health, some stigmatization of needing to access care outside of the family, outside of clergy. or outside of the church. And so, I think that's shifting, fortunately. I think, my practice is a DC-based practice, and 90% of the clients that I serve are Black. And that's a real shift from all of the clients I served as a trainee. Most of my clients in my training programs were white. And so as an independent practitioner who is very much committed to being in the community and serving my community, it's been really important to me to really start to dismantle stigma and make access to therapy with a Black therapist available. And I think that's shifting, but it's slow. The work is slow, and more work certainly needs to be done, but there aren't many of us. Even in DC, there aren't a lot of us in a city that's almost 50% Black. And so finding us can be difficult depending on where you live.
I'd just add that the methods of therapy that we're trained in aren't often related to the healing practice that we have a legacy of in our community. I think that's unfortunate. So I did have the opportunity to take a Black psychology class, and the first half of my training was completed at Howard University. So it's in an HBCU setting where the structure around the community is serving Black people, thinking about Black people, even how we assign diagnosis in the context of race. But most people don't have that experience. And so the strategies you learn, the techniques you learn, the theories you learn are often based in white, middle-class, hegemonic, masculine ideas of what therapy could be or should be. And I think they're not enough. If they're even useful, they're not enough. So at a minimum, they need to be culturally adapted most of the time. And at most, they need to be decolonized and dismissed and replaced with the ones that we've had a history of using that people didn't get licensed for or paid for, and that we could, what's the right word I'm thinking of, that we can harness that wisdom and excellence and brilliance and maybe structure it if it needs to be. I don't know that it needs to be, in ways that it can be disseminated to people who are training to do this work. It used to be through rites of passage. So you used to have a family member or a community member who would say, who's going to be a healer? Let me show you through apprenticeship. But we don't have that model anymore. And that's not the model that's sanctioned by accrediting bodies. So we have to do some work for integrating that. And there are some books out there on Indigenous healing methods and Black therapy processes and healing circles and things like that. But we don't tend to use those texts in APA accredited programs as much as we should.
I think on that note, ABSI is a great resource for that very reason, because they have intentionally created membership and space for Black psychologists, Black psychology to exist. And there are published journals, articles, there's a wealth of knowledge. Again, as you said, Dr. Hargons, that is not acknowledged, unfortunately, by all of our colleagues. And so I want to publicly put that out there, that use ABSI during this time as a resource.
I also just want to throw out there, Dr. Hargons, I think you made some really valid points. And if we think about this, in the next few years, the makeup of this country is really going to change, where minorities are going to take up a larger portion than we have in the past. And so I think it is critical that in our field, we are up to date.
Yeah.
You know, we are up to date. Everything that we're doing is culturally relevant, because we're going to look different soon. And so I think that's something important to highlight.
We used to have a model where you had to learn a second language to graduate. Like, you had to be multilingual to be able to be a psychologist. I don't know what happened to that. Do you remember that, Dr. Pittman? Was that a part?
It was not a part of my training.
Oh, okay.
that certainly historically did exist, but I might not have made it.
I didn't make it, but but I know that it did exist, and I don't know why we did away with that. But I think it's important to have access to other languages and linguistic styles too.
And I think, to that point, I think like most Black people, I too speak Black vernacular English.
Yes.
Multilingual,
Yep.
which often in session. But I think the other piece of that that's really important, that is a real failing of our discipline. Most of my colleagues have, particularly in academic spaces, have been academics for 10, 15, 20 years. And so the completion of their training is even older than that, right? So if we think about how the work of diversity and multiculturalism has shifted, and understandings of how to integrate cultural practice has really shifted in the past decade. It's rapidly evolving. The language we use is rapidly changing. How we understand people in context is shifting. And what we ask of them, if they're psychologists, if they're practicing, is to maintain their license as a diversity continuing ed. But I'm like, a continuing ed unit is not going to update 20-year-old antiquated knowledge sufficiently to show up in a space that's culturally relevant. So it really is incumbent upon, academics, because those are the ones who are training new therapists to update their knowledge in meaningful ways. It's a luxury and a privilege to not have to do that because it's not required of you. But I think if you are training future mental health practitioners, that it should be required, and it should be meaningfully required. Now, I've done some really wonderful continuing eds, but again, that's a 2 to 3 hour engagement, every 2 years, and that's certainly not sufficient.
In some states, such as Kentucky, does not have a requirement for multicultural continuing education, which is unfortunate in a state that is largely and predominantly white, because we miss an opportunity to refine, even at the the most basic of levels, how we understand culture and how that evolves over time. So that's our work. We need to get on that.
Right, absolutely.
So in the interest of time, we're going to allow for questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, please type it below and I will read it to the panel, myself and Aneesha. I see some questions here already about resources. We did prepare a slideshow and we will be sending out those resources that we have available. So please do type your questions in the chat box.
All right.
You see it?
Okay, so we have a question. It is, what are your thoughts on how colorism play into this conversation?
The conversation as it relates to mental health, as the conversation as it relates to racism, I think those are different. I think, colorism shows up, I think particularly as it relates to racism based on one's proximity to whiteness, right? So the closer you are to whiteness, perhaps the varied your experiences are with racism. I grew up, obviously I'm not close to whiteness. My proximity to whiteness is not close. But having grown up, I grew up in the projects, and so all of my neighbors were Black, but I've always gone to predominantly white schools. And so, I got really accustomed really quickly to being the chocolate chip on the sugar cookie. I really had to know how to navigate white space. And I think the colorism shows up in those ways, because if people assume you pass, they may assume you're one of them. So it sort of may mitigate some of the, the experience, the connection to racism that you have. But recognizing that you may pass, but you also, the moment you identify as Black or as a person of color, that you give up whatever privilege you are accessing by virtue of colorism, I think. So that's also an important distinction to, you might be in group and then you can quickly be out group, sort of once you identify that you're a person of color. I think in terms of mental health, I have clients across the color spectrum, and I think, the internalized experience of racism, whether it's in their own families as the lightest or the darkest, whatever position they occupy, can adversely affect their mental health. being, you know, and as we've mentioned, being the only or one of few in a workplace, in a school setting, in a program, you know, I think all of those experiences, I think, can be influenced by colorism.
I think understanding colorism as in service of white supremacy is important. So the fact that colorism is a way to say, here are these limited resources we're going to give you as a people. And we see this in all people of color who have been colonized. We see this in all of those racial and ethnic groups. But here's the limited resources we're going to assign for your group of people. Now, those of you who are probably in some way through your aesthetic, your physiognomy, closer to whiteness, you'll get a little bit more so that there can be dissension amongst you, so that the limited resources are then meted out by you who are closer to us, who we placed additional value on. And I think that then leads to division and a lack of unity within our community. And so that exacerbates symptoms of stress when you experience it. And it costs you some humanity when you buy into it. I'd also say that when you think about our training institutions and our history, so a few years ago, I did just a scan of all the HBCU presidents and a paper bag test. Like, do you pass or not the paper bag test, which was what was used as criteria to get into many HBCUs historically. And at that time, this may not be the case now, that was a few years ago. At that time, 8 out of 10 passed the paper bag test. So people in the highest possible position at universities that are Black, taking out the piece related to how whiteness might organize that system in particular, still represent a lighter complexion on the colorism scale. And so I think it lets us know that we're still in many ways buying into it. It's still in our music and how we associate gender with lightness as opposed to other aspects of a person's identity, how we treat people who are brutalized based on skin color. I think that people who are all Black, but darker skin, middle complexion, whatever that would be, lighter complexion, whatever that would be, they have an equitable distribution of the consequences they get when they're incarcerated. So just those nuances are really important when thinking about how colorism still impacts how people experience their lives day to day, and then the stress that facilitates.
So we have another question. Someone wants to know, how do you suggest bringing up racism with older Black clients who do not want to talk about their experiences? I just had this experience last week.
Gently, the same way you would with a person who has been sexually assaulted. You don't want to assign any language to that they haven't given for themselves. You want to let them know that when they're ready, that you're ready to talk about it with them, and that's it. You don't want to push. You want to let them know that you are a holding space for when they're ready to have that space held. But that's the way I approach it.
I agree. I also think it's important that whatever the response is, whatever the pace is validated and not seen as an inappropriate time to press or seek information or suddenly leverage your client to get information or to educate yourself. And so to be mindful and ethical within our boundaries when talking about this, and to make sure that we are honoring and viewing it as a trauma.
I would just add to that. I think the first is to explore why they're not either ready to share it or ready to share it with you. So you may be the barrier to them talking about that. And that's okay, right? You know, there's a therapist for every journey, and every journey is not for every therapist. And so it's important to recognize that you may not be the person to walk them through that pain or that trauma. I think the second piece of that, as therapists, we are quick to assert that therapy is a safe space, and we really have to stop doing that. We are not the arbiters of safe space. Our clients are the arbiter of safe space, so they get to decide when the space feels safe for them. All we can do is hold space that hopefully feels open and non-judgmental, and that we show up and they see that we will show up for them. But until they deem that it is safe, at that point, all you have is an office, and you're a therapist. And you've got to recognize that. So we've really got to stop force feeding therapy as a safe space, because it is not. And historically, it has not been a safe space. It has been a stigmatizing space. It has been a judgmental space. It has been an invalidating space. It has been a pathologizing space. And we cannot divorce ourselves from that, even if we aren't practicing it. And if we're being intentional about not practicing it, we can certainly state that. But again, your clients will see it, right? Like, I don't have to come in and say that I'm explicitly anti-racist in my approach. My clients will see that through my actions, through the questions, through their experience. And so it becomes really, really important to make sure that you're not trying to assuage your own anxieties or your own insecurities by forcing your clients to let you into a space that you have not earned.
That's really good. Thank you, Dr. Pittman. The next question I have, what are your thoughts on finding the balance between Black folk not needing to be overly tasked with educating our white and other persons of color on racism, and us wanting to ensure that our message and voices are not absent from critical spaces seeking to address systemic racism?
I like to use invoices for that. So, if a Black woman asks me to do something, likely I'm gonna be like, yes. And when do you need me? If I can fit it in my schedule, I'm gonna work really hard to be there. For organizations who have historically oppressed Black people, how much this is going to cost is important, because that lets me know your level of investment. So here's my speaking fee schedule. I would love to be a part of this conversation for this number of people for this amount of time at this price point. If that doesn't work for you, then there are other people I can recommend to you who have different ranges and levels of speaking fee schedule that might better fit. But it's important that you pay for that, because that's emotional labor. Presenting, creating, facilitating, educating, that is expertise, that is skill. I mean, that doesn't come easily, not through lived experience alone. A lot of people identify as Black, but they're not experts in how to facilitate these conversations, nor should they be, because that's not the way they were trained, and that's not even their field. So I think it's important to pay experts to do the work.
And I just want to add a correction in there. That individual wanted me to clarify, I meant access to free mental health services free of charge.
Oh. Like free therapy?
Said free of charge.
Gonna be hard to find. There certainly are increases in organizations that are, fundraising, crowdsourcing, things like that to cover the costs of therapy for folks. As Dr. Hargons mentioned, it's access to an expertise, right? And so free therapy is hard to find unless you're in maybe a community mental health agency or you have insurance, in which case, your insurance will cover the majority of that costs. But there are organizations like the Loveland Foundation. I know DCPA is offering some pro bono support therapy services here in the district. And there might be other organizations at the state level, depending on where you are, that offer them. But by and large, free mental health services are really hard to come by.
I know at the Center for, oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was going to say real quick that the Boris Hansen Foundation was offering free therapy services at one point too. And I don't know if they're already full or not, but that'd be another one to check.
Yeah, at the Center for Healing Racial Trauma, we do it on a sliding scale based on income, and we never turn any, we only serve therapeutically Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And so we never turn anyone away for inability to pay. And the work that we do on the consulting side, which is why I send invoices, subsidizes that work. So when we work with organizations or school systems or businesses or religious institutions who pay for the full amount of the consultation or training or workshops they're experiencing, then that subsidizes our ability to provide the therapy at whatever income level works for the clients that request our services through therapies.
Thank you so much. I just want to reiterate again, we will be sending out resources to the audience, as well as our lovely panelists' information where you can contact them on Instagram, Facebook, and as well as their personal websites. So I have a really good question for the panel, because the whole point of this webinar was to talk about the compounding racism that we constantly face. And right now we're seeing things as crazy as people getting lynched in the year of 2020. So one of our audience members asked, how can therapists advocate for the Black community with regards to the narrative right now that Black people being found hanging from trees died by suicide?
I mean, I think it's critically important to challenge. I think there have been, to my knowledge, in the past maybe month or so, about seven Black folks who have been found hanging from trees. I think, first of all, recognizing we have collective trauma around this. So culturally, this is abnormal. And so, I think it's also really important to recognize. That's not to say suicide does not happen in the Black community. Suicide rates are rising in the Black community, particularly around our kiddos. And so that's also important to recognize, that Black people do commit suicide, and we have to dispel those myths as well. I think it's important to really critically question the level of investigation that's happened. Most of these hangings or lynchings that have been deemed suicides don't have very thorough investigations. They're not looking for evidence of scuffles or bruises that might indicate that this is not a voluntary act. But I also, I think it's important to be aware that it's happening. If you are Black, to be vigilant when you are out. I think certainly that we now have a platform that has given rise to a white supremacist voice and anger that is a real threat to your lived experience daily. And so, I think as therapists, I think it's just important to be really critical of the narratives that are being pushed in the media, regardless of what that is around violence towards Black people.
I think a question I always ask is, who does this narrative serve? And I invite my students to do that. Like, who does this narrative serve? Who does this definition of racism serve? Who does this type of pathology serve? And I don't care how you align with what the view is. Asking that question is one that requires multidisciplinary understanding of what we're talking about today. So, being researchers, many of us were trained with those skills, and you have to continue to use them.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone on the panel. We appreciate this. Has been awesome dialogue between us all, and thank you for those participants who have asked questions. We appreciate you. We have close to about 10 minutes left, and so at this point, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Smedley for any closing remarks.
Thank you. I really want to just take this moment and thank all of you who joined today, especially our panelists, Dr. Hargons, Dr. Pittman. Your work is fabulous. It is amazing, needed, and on time. And I just appreciate your representation in this field, but also for our fellow Black peers. Jojo and Aneesha, thank you for this amazing facilitation. You are representing the pipeline of Black mental health, and we need you right now and really encourage you to keep doing this work. So thank you for this. On behalf of DCPA, as the co-chair of the DCPA Task Force for COVID-19, I want to thank everyone for joining in. Please make sure that you stay tuned on our website, dcpsychology.org, our social media, to continue staying abreast of our resources. And also past events, past videos are posted on our YouTube channel. But just, really want to reiterate gratitude.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you to everyone who's joined. There are so many of you listening, so we appreciate you all spending the last hour and a half with us, for sure.
Absolutely. And as JoJo said, we will send these resources out and likely post amongst our social media as well.
I also have a closing remark. I just want to thank the lovely panel and Aneesha for holding this space with me. It was so fun and traumatizing and healing and all the things in between that to create this space and to facilitate this space. So thank you so much for being my village. I can't wait to bug you guys about resources and what are the next steps so we can be the change that we want to see. So thank you so much. And I literally love you guys.
We love you too.
Love you too.
Yes, I love you, JoJo. Thank you. Thank you. This has been awesome.